Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. Would like to welcome all of you to today's event. Would like to welcome the people here in our seminar room. Would like to welcome the people who are following us on Zoom and also the people who are on live stream. So welcome to all of you to an event that is co-organized with our colleagues from the Scandinavian department today and also our Austrian Studies program here at the Institute of European Studies. I will be assisted as moderator in today's event by Karin Liebhardt, professor at the University of Vienna, who later this semester will be teaching here on the Berkeley campus a course on right-wing politics and political communication in Austria. So thank you so much, Karin, for joining us and being with us today. Let me then welcome today's speaker. Andreas Önnerfors is professor in intellectual history and currently also a visiting professor at UC Berkeley's Department of Scandinavian Studies. In Europe, he holds a position as Dean of Humanities of the European Academy of Science and Arts in Salzburg, Austria. And he also runs a forecasting enterprise in Sweden called Hyperhelikon Ideas Consulting. Professor Önnerfors is specialized in the cultural history of the 18th century. He has over the last decade developed a research profile, however, in radicalization studies and conspiracy theories. He's the author of several books, among which I can mention Freemasonry, a very short introduction from 2017, also the co-author editor of the volumes Expressions of Radicalization, Global Politics, Processes and Practices, 2018, and Conspiracy Theories and the Nordic Countries from 2021, and Europe, Continent of Conspiracies, Conspiracy Theories in and about Europe from 2021 as well. Moreover, Professor Önnerfors has written a report for the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, MSB, about COVID-19 related conspiracy theories and how to counter them. It is his latest book, the one on Europe, Continent of Conspiracies, that Professor Önnerfors will present to us today. This presentation will take about 35 minutes, and it will be followed by Q&A. During the presentation, all of you are invited to post questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to pass on a selection of these questions to our speaker during the Q&A session. But for now, please relax and enjoy the presentation. Andreas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Dear Director Jeroen de Wolf, dear colleagues and visitors present in person and online. On the brink of a new war on European territory, an impending invasion of the sovereign states of the Ukraine by Russia, it appears as a tragic duty to reflect on the meaning of Europe in the light of conspiratorial imagination. Over the past decade, conspiracy theories as alternative explanation of world events have taken to the front stage of the political discourse worldwide. The US presidential elections of 2016 and 2020 are a case in point, with their ominous epiphany, the storming of the US Capitol on 6th of January 2021, and the ensuing myth of a stolen election, the myth of the big lie that still divides the United States until this day. And while a focus of attention, research and media coverage has been on strange phenomena in the US like QAnon, Europe also had its fair share in the promotion of conspiracy theories and politics, such as the 2011 terrorist attacks in Norway, Brexit, 2016, and persistent Russian influence operations. During the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, conspiratorial ideas about covert and malign manipulation of our lives has spiraled out of proportion. The viral infodemic has promoted knowledge resistance, mobilization, and socialization around alternative world explanations, defying logic, as much as the sound foundations of expert knowledge and trusted media. We witness a crisis of the explanatory power of scientific reason, the normative foundations of societies ruled by law, and of international order within the framework of idealism of international law. The impending invasion of the Ukraine proves how aggressive realism, propelled by authoritarian readings of world order, prompts a return to anarchy. The idea that political action is unbound, a natural conflict of free will and raw power. Very fittingly, many of the anti-corona protests we have observed lately, whether they took place on the streets of Stockholm, Berlin, London, or Ottawa, operate under the pretense of unrestricted freedom. The idea that freedom always, in the sense of Jesaja Berlin, is positive, a right to something, unbound, direct, unspecified, unaccountable, and therefore a tool of totalitarian power rather than deliberate democracy, with its clear separation of powers. While we see the aggressive attempts to the anarchization of European space unfold in front of our eyes, within European societies, conspiracy theories risks to undermine established principles of political conversation as well. My truth, whether it's Googled from unsolicited sources on the internet or not, is as valid as your truth, the claim goes. Agreed and century-old mode of knowledge generation derailed, turned into a polysemic information landscape without any maps or any skills to navigate it properly. This seems to be yet another parallel to the events at the eastern borders of Europe. Two different modes of perceiving geopolitics and its normative foundations. Almost as having to reconcile flat earthers and those of us who have accepted heliocentrism, gravity, and the Big Bang as a legitimate result of 500 years of astronomy on scientific grounds. This is where the image you can see displayed comes in. It's a piece of propaganda to demonstrate to the Ukraine in the center which way to take. To the right, to reconnect to angelic, pan-Slavic ideas of cultural and religious might, coupled with references to victory in World War II and space and traditional values. Or turn to the satanic left, to the West and the EU as a continuation of the Third Reich, which you can see up there, where decadence, destruction, and dictatorship rule in an unholy alliance, with drug addiction and pride as the markers of ultimate downfall. The answer seems obvious. Apocalypse to the left, resurrection to the right, your choice. But let us now return to the topic of the day. The book, Europe, Continent of Conspiracies, Conspiracy Theories in and About Europe. Between 2016 and 2020, the project Compact gathered around 150 researchers from 35 countries for collaborative research, which resulted in the publication of the first handbook of conspiracy theories in 2020, just weeks before the COVID-19 pandemic started. We also launched a series of, and recorded a series of podcasts in 5 parts on the conversation and a book series. I have hitherto co-edited and co-authored 2 of the types in the book series on Europe and the other on Nordic countries. These are 2 titles Jerome de Wolf was talking about before. And the book on the Nordic countries I used this spring as course literature in my course here at UC Berkeley. Our book on Europe consists of 13 chapters. We open the thematic part of our volume with a volume shedding light on a new European order. Based on a meta-analysis of different studies and surveys, the authors Kroll and Van Prooyen argue that it is possible to determine a clear correlation between Euroscepticism and conspiracy belief. The authors propose that Euroscepticism and belief in conspiracy theories are inherently and mutually related, and develop an argument as to why this may be the case. In particular, Euroscepticism is central to the ideologies of radical, populist, extremist, and nationalist political movements across the European Union. The central thrust is that the EU is a malevolent entity undermining national sovereignty caused by the domination within EU institutions of internationalists and globalists who conspire to undermine European Christian culture. The next set of chapters, 3 to 5, explore the position of Islam as the absolute other in these conspiracy beliefs, threatening to turn Europe into dystopian Eurabia through aggressive invasion and finally terminal replacement. Whereas Bergman, the author of chapter 3, provides with an overview of the historical development and use of these tropes in different waves of European nativist populist partisan movements, author of chapter 4, Gualda, focuses on the metaphors of invasion, visual and textual, as transmitted in social media. Their meanings are shaped around the main matrix of fear, subdivided into 5 frequently overlapping areas concerning demographic, religious, political, economical, and cultural identity-related matters. And presenting the German translation of French writer Renaud Camus on the Great Replacement, my chapter develops how conspiratorial frames of terrorist violence were shaped, within which the meaning of the terrorist manifestos of Halle and Hanau in 2019 and 2020, respectively, could be constructed. Such beliefs are furthermore fueled by movements denying the contemporary political order of Europe as a hoax, as exemplified in chapter 6. In chapter 6, the author Buchmeier describes the peculiar case of the German Reich citizen movement and its internal tension between historical revisionism and utopianism, and in which a huge part of the conspiracy narrative is substantiated with pseudo-legal arguments. Buchmeier is also able to show how conspiracy culture of denial can serve as a platform of socialization, so to form a group around the message. Being at the fringes of social political development in Germany, when we wrote the book in 2019, people almost didn't know what the Reich citizens were. They were a fringe topic. There was one madman which had shot the tax agent. The Reich citizens have, during the recent anti-COVID-19 process, received considerable attention. They were the first to storm a government building in August 2020 in Berkeley, waving the flags of the old German Empire. And there are considerable overlaps to the sovereign citizens movement and pseudo-legalist discourses in global anti-corona movements that deserve closer examination. The next 2 chapters engage with conspiracy rhetoric in media. As explained by author Zhu Zhu, enemy images about Germany and tropes of victimization were evoked in media discourses related to the fiscal policies of the EU in Greece during the Greek debt crisis. Using data from a corpus of approximately 8,000 articles taken from 4 large circulation Greek newspapers in the 2010 to 2013 period, Zhu Zhu's findings show that after 2010, conspiracy theories appear in many articles about German hegemony and the Germans as Nazis aiming to reconquer Europe by means of austerity and financial discipline because they failed to do so during the Second World War. And if you remember that Ukrainian propaganda picture, that appears on that picture as well. The idea that the EU is a continuation of the Third Reich. This other world explanation that we need to understand how it works. In a similar vein, in the next chapter, Iris Madurana looks into populist conspiracy rhetoric and arguments on EU immigration in 3 pro-Brexit British mid-markets and tabloids, the Daily Mail, the Express, the Sun. During the EU referendum debates in between February and June 2016, an episode we almost would like to forget, but that is there and that can be researched. Maturana examines the strategic use of populist conspiracy theory in the lead arguments on EU immigration in order to make certain premises selectively salient and thus orient audiences towards the conclusion that Britain should leave the European Union, a process defined in media theory or media study as framing. The chapter identifies several framing strategies that draw upon populist conspiracy theories. The final part of the book is concerned with how different state actors engage with various conspiratorial images of Europe. As Armin Lange argues in chapter 9, the figure of the eternal Soros is, for instance, a well-established trope in the rhetorical arsenal of the Hungarian government, in a toxic combination of covert anti-Semitism and outright Islamophobia. Lange explains how the 2015 refugee crisis was framed as a Soros plan, with 7 strategic points on the agenda, all related to orchestrated mass migration, the opening of borders, forced distribution of immigrants and forced payments, lenience towards criminals, and finally, political attacks against all opponents of that plan. Cloaking its true ideological position, the chapter reminds us that dog whistle politics, such as those in Hungary, can move from mere political rhetoric to violence, as the 2018 attack on Pittsburgh Synagogue vividly illustrates, that also made reference to George Soros. In chapter 10, we have a group of scholars from Southeast Europe, Dlanusha, Denkowski, Firanowski, and Ionesca, a co-written chapter about EU-related conspiracy theories in the Western Balkans that fuel what they call a considerable Euro ambivalence, which is an interesting term. Defining the Western Balkans vis-à-vis Europe has produced a variety of identity narratives in these aspiring countries, some which are based on increasingly conspiratorial worldviews. This broad palette of attitudes ranges from hard Euroscepticism to hard Europhilia, characterized as uncritical opposition or unwavering support for the EU. And interestingly, these both opposites share some similar features, because both represent dynamic constructs. They are also facilitated by non-transparent governments, prolonged EU accession processes, and foreign influences, and as well as consequences conceptualized as conspiratorial narratives and related mythologies in this chapter. And they are theorized at 2 positions in that discourse. One is Euro-vilification, so the EU is bad and the gateway to hell, or Euro-fundamentalism, the EU is good and the gateway to heaven. Also, as you could see, some of the conceptualizations in that propaganda image from the Ukraine I showed you at the beginning, because the Western Balkans are also prone to pro-Kremlin influence operations. Because these positions are partly influenced by negative Russian perceptions of Europe, which are then treated in the last 2 chapters of the book. Based on the newsletters released by the EU East Stratcom Task Force, which was established in 2015, and which is now has transformed into EU versus disinformation, author Boyevich in this chapter presents a discourse analysis of 80 disinformation stories published in pro-Kremlin media in Eastern Europe between 2015 and 2017. There are 4 main conspiracy narratives that he found here, describing the EU as anti-Christian, anti-heterosexual entity, as a totalitarian project or a vassal of the United States of America or other powerful actors. Also, these ideas expressed in the image I showed you in the beginning. And finally, in our last thematic chapter, Mölder argues that these images of conspiracy have informed new strategic narratives and nurturing a culture of fear in dramatized international relations shaped by infected status conflicts. Well, that's an analysis we had in 2019. And if you take that sentence and look at what's happening in the Ukraine today, you would say that's a prophetic reading of what's playing out in front of our eyes now. So Möller's chapter explored how conspiracy theories support the constructed image of a declining, weak, and vulnerable continent, operationalized by Russian-produced narratives. These are based on cultural, historical, and religious myths, and describe the European Union as a declining monster, created by political elites and suffering under the poisonous influence of liberal and tolerant values. Now to our conclusions of the book. Myself and my co-editor Crowell aim to unpack the black box of conspiracy theorizing in and about Europe. Because catering to both quasi-rational and moral needs, the alleged explanatory potential of conspiracy theories makes them also easily adaptable to the news cycles of traditional media, propelled by the agenda-setting virality of social media. So something very much turns into viral news in social media, it will be picked up by the mainstream news cycle of traditional media as well. And that affects also a kind of more normal information landscape like in Europe, where you don't have a strong polarization as here, for instance, between Fox News and CNN. So directly and indirectly, extreme positions and opinions are mainstream and widely circulated through media dissemination. The narrative of conspiracy theories on Europe makes them in turn compatible with the thin ideology and performative style of populism, and in particular neo-authoritarianism, which explains growing electoral support in many European countries. However, the conspiracy theories about Europe also represent a contradictory dualism between the absolute power and absolute weakness, because on the one hand, the European Union is described as a monster that can rule the details of everyday life of all European people. But on the other hand, it's also portrayed as a dying, decadent monster. So it's on the same time both very weak and has total control. And that contradictory dualism has almost mythical dimension of political identity formation. When I was writing the chapter, I'm a big fan of Richard Wagner and his operas. I was thinking about the gods. That's how Odin is portrayed in Wagner's operas, because he's both super potent and he's too weak to stop the downfall of the world in the Ragnarok, in the final collapse of the world. Which is a weird thing. So how can you imagine something that's absolutely powerful on the one hand and absolutely definitely dying at the same time? But in the contemporary political climate, shaped by the effects of the global COVID-19 pandemic, new alignments of a dystopian politics of fear are expressed. I will soon move to the finish of my presentation, but please allow me to expand on two models that we present in the book before I arrive to our general conclusion. First, we claim that the meaning of Europe in conspiratorial narrative is constructed along the line of a tension between internal dissolution and external extermination. And to our mind, it's possible to generalize this model and project it upon different attempts to delineate the downfall of the European continent. Internal enemies were already scapegoated when Europe engaged in its first colonial expansion during the Crusades. Faced with the fierce opposition and expansion of the Muslim and later Ottoman other, blame was projected on the European Jews, and the conspiratorial myth of blood libel invented to channel societal and political frustrations. After the French Revolution, when the modern conspiracy was born at the same time as modern political ideologies, the downfall of church and crown was explained as a cabal of superhuman cosmopolitans, Knights Templars, Illuminati, and assassins. 100 years later, the famous Protocols of the Elder of Zion projected persistent frustrations with the project of modernization into fantasies of Jewish world domination, effectively laying the ground for genocides during the 20th century. And such ideas returned the connection with the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 and 2016, when the purported downfall of Europe, completely ignoring the extended suffering of the entire Middle East and North African region, again was blamed upon unholy alliances or the manipulations of Jewish businessmen, American secret services, liberal elites of do-gooders, and of course, the European Union. We believe that this model, unfortunately, will be reproduced time after another. And it also explains the narrative logic behind the Manichaean phantasms of Russian influence operations. The second model explains more in detail that threat is at the heart of imagination of dissolution and extermination. Threats can be evoked in different thematic domains, ranging from religion, culture and identity, demography, politics, and economy. And a new domain has recently been added to these five, which is environment. Fears relate in most generalizing terms to heteronomy, to be controlled by someone else and lose autonomy, to be outnumbered, to lose power, wealth, status, significance, and cultural capital, together with their primordial habitat. So we have a new conspiracy theory in eco-fascism that immigration goes against the habitat of the natural populations of Europe. So for environmental reasons, we shouldn't have any immigration. So that could be added here as a sixth thematic domain. But let us now quickly move to our conclusions. One of our main suggestions is that conspiracy theories, as mainstreamed and normalized in societal discourse, play into the hand of populist political forces, endangering and undermining democratic institutions and the rule of law in both domestic and international politics across the continent. Again, this was written before this recent Ukraine conflict played out, so I think we have reasons to unfortunately be proud of our analytical analysis here. We also encouraged our colleagues, for instance, in political studies, to embrace the mythical as a variety of the political. We need to engage with expressions of such deep-seated constructions of meaning about the continent in order to grasp complex processes of cultural and political identification, and as the outcome of that, to understand political globalization. Finally, we are concerned with creating a greater conceptual clarity of the term conspiracy theory and propose that it can be likened with a black box in which ethical and epistemological reasoning intersect. Their impact upon the mainstreaming of extreme content in media and societal discourse at large cannot be ignored. For instance, the idea that power and freedom are best exercised directly and without accountability and outside any normative framework such as law or international law. Bizarrely enough, in these conspiratorial fantasies is mirrored a nostalgic longing to obedience security. That's a term by sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. The idea of protection by an all-encompassing and coercive Leviathan. But when it comes to Europe itself, conspiracy theories tell the story of an entity that either has absolute or suffocating power, a trope mobilized, for instance, during Brexit, or so weak and corrupt that it deserves to die, as in Russian imagination, collapse and resurrect in a new version. In what we call new and contradictory politics of fear, we are able to trace new and unexpected alliances, realignments, and reactions. For example, as expressed during the COVID-19 pandemic, whenever environmental activists could protest together with diehard right-wing extremists. And these new realignments prompt us to search for new explanatory vocabulary, since it seems that the process of dilution of political ideologies accelerated further. And whatever is brewing in contemporary domestic and international politics, the push towards unaccounted freedom, the erosion of the separation of powers and normative frameworks of idealism, cannot be grasped entirely with conventional methods of analysis. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Andreas. Very good summary, I think, of the book. Lots of ideas for us to talk about. We have about 25 minutes for a Q&A. And I suggest that perhaps we start the Q&A with our guest in Austria, Professor Karen Liebhardt. I will give you the first question, Karen. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your fascinating talk and for these insights in your book, which is very much needed, and I'm sure it will inspire a lot of different disciplines. So I have a couple of questions, but let me start with the first one. I would be interested in learning more about whether you think that there is a European pattern. I mean, the differences between the northern countries, the southern European countries, or the Balkans, the West Balkan states, or is there still an East-West divide in terms of how these conspiracy theories and the increase of the conspiracy theories develops?
Yeah, if your question is about the historical development, I would say there is a considerable similarity between this idea of external extermination and eternal dissolution. When it comes to how Europe is perceived today, we have an East-West divide in the conspiratorial imagination, in the sense that conspiracy theories about the West of Europe have very much their origin and are supported and fueled by pro-Kremlin influence operations, which we can see. And they resonate with other ideas that are developed in the West, for instance, by an author like Camus, who wrote this book about the Great Replacement, or pro-Israeli conspiracy theories like the Eurasia theory and so on. But the main division line is East-West, where they originate today. Yeah? But the pattern of perceiving Europe as being exposed to both threats of external extermination and internal dissolution, they are to be found everywhere. So there's not a big difference. And I mean, I think, and then if we look at the developments of the last 2 years, it's really interesting to see how similar these developments are across European space. So if you go and visit a pro-freedom demonstration in Vienna or in Stockholm or Copenhagen or in Paris or in London or Berlin, it's the same topics, it's the same realignments. That was what I finished my paper with, that we have this new, I know it's a controversial theory in political theory, but that theory about the horseshoe where the extremes are closer to each other. And that deserves more investigation, I think.
Andreas, let me maybe ask a quick question myself before I give the audience a chance to ask a question. But what came to my mind was the following. So you presented your study. Mm-hmm. We learned a lot about different types of conspiracy theories. We also learned about the danger that these mm-hmm. theories represent. Could you tell us also a little bit about your findings about the reason why so many people fall for these theories and embrace those theories? Did your investigation bring up some ideas, some explanation for it?
Yes, for sure. And of course, I mean, what our big project showed, Compact, definitely, is that you can see a nexus between systematic changes and systematic shocks, like a pandemic. A systematic change, let's call it, for instance, the French Revolution, is a political change. But then you have what we call strategic shocks, like the pandemic, which you could maybe prepare for a pandemic, but you wouldn't know when it would come. It's a strategic shock. And in both systematic changes and strategic shocks, the need for people to find explanations for why these things happen increases. And that's in personal psychology, political psychology. And at that very moment, you want to see, that's in the black box model, explain more. You want to see a nexus between input and output. You want to get a clear explanation, what kind of input occasions that output. And you are more prone to accept a shortcut when it is a very traumatizing event, an easy explanation. And also when it is a systematic change or a strategic shock, which makes that many people suffer from it, you also want to scapegoat. And you also want to understand, why do you yourself not have power to engage in that and stop it or something like that? So there comes this moral component or the ethical component in as well. So that is how we explain that in these moments, the susceptibility to believe in the explanatory potential of conspiracy theories rises. Then, of course, lots of things I have to leave out here because out of time reasons, who uses conspiracy theories? And that could also be an answer to your question, because some people use conspiracy theories to consolidate their power top down. Others use it to express political frustrations bottom up. Influence operations use them to influence outside in, and for group identity, it is inside out. My group has suffered from your group's attacks, blah, 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 and so on. So this has also to be taken into consideration. But the main explanation is systematic changes, strategic shocks.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Andreas. Let me open the floor for questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question in the audience. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you so much for a very rich and illuminating talk. I look forward to reading your book. I wonder if you could maybe get out of Europe for just a second and see if you can compare the sort of conspiratorial milieu of the United States with Europe. Now, one of the things that is present in Europe is, as you said, there's an east-west divide. Well, when I last visited Eastern Europe, every tour guide started with, "We used to be much bigger." That our country was bigger, we were a player.
Yeah.
And so the national identity is both awkward but much firmer than in the United States, where we don't have an ethnic definition of Americans, whereas Hungarians do. So where does the American milieu come from and derive its power? Because it seems to be very powerful, despite the fact it doesn't have not many people know George Soros.
Yeah.
Maybe, Andreas, before you answer, if you could briefly summarize the question, how you understood it.
Oh, yes.
I'm not sure if people in Zoom could hear Chris.
I understand the question from the audience as that how can we compare our findings in Europe with the United States? And in particular, what I wrote down here, the identity of decline. For instance, and now I make up, but I take it from your story. I make up the story that you are somewhere in a country that formerly belonged to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or in a country that formerly belonged to the Russian Empire, or even the Ottoman Empire. And they all three tour guides will say, we have been much bigger and more mighty. So the identity of decline, maybe, or something like that, is that something that's important, and how does that compare to the United States? And where does that come from? Is that correct?
More or less, but Eastern Europe, they have a much firmer sense of national identity.
Yes.
Than the United States.
Exactly. And this idea of the collapse of might kind of comes in. Yeah, I think what is not, we have had lots of contacts with our American colleagues doing the project, and we really try to delineate what might be significantly different. But I think that in the entire chapter of introduction, I'm kind of giving a historical panorama of this fear of external extermination and internal dissolution. And my impression is that the fear of external extermination not is as strong in the United States than it is in Europe. Because Europe is a peninsula of the Eurasian continent. It has been attacked over the last millennia from outside forces, so to speak. If it is an own construct, what Europe is open to very much semantic unclarity. whereas what the United States is kind of pretty clear since 1776, more or less, in the eyes of the majority. So I think there we have the difference. What constitutes Europe is an area of constant negotiation. It is the outcome of these complex rise and fall of empires and the different projections in civilization and culture. Whereas here you have a more coherent definition of what America is, maybe derailed over the last 10 years, but certainly I would claim, but I'm not sure, that the figure of external extermination not is as strong and pronounced in the American discourse, but rather the figure of the internal dissolution and the internal traders coming into the country. But I would be happy to continue discussion about that.
Before we go for a second question from the audience, let me maybe turn back to our guest from Vienna, to Karin Liebhardt. Because Karin, you indicated that you had several questions that came to your mind. So why don't you ask a second question at this point for Andreas? Go ahead, Karin.
Yeah, with pleasure. I ask a second question, and I would be very interested in the role the concept of whiteness plays in these conspiracy theories.
Yes, the concept of whiteness. It's relatively new, and the difference between the Arabia conspiracy theory that, to cut it short, motivated Bering Breivik to commit his terrorist attack in Oslo, was not yet that impregnated with ideas of white supremacy, whereas the Great Replacement conspiracy theory has nurtured some kind of global whiteness ideology. Because the idea of the Great Replacement was chanted in Charlottesville, Camus commented on that, and echoes in the terrorist attack of New Zealand, Christchurch, and goes again in the German terrorist attacks of 2019 and 2020. So I think it has become increasingly important over the last 10 years. And it has become a part of the Great Replacement fueled conspiracy theories in recent terrorist attacks. And the vessel for the communication of that is the Great Replacement thing, and also the global organization of these networks.
Let me go back at this point to the audience. We still have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So Annie, for another question.
Okay, I'll try to speak loudly, maybe it will go. Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting and fascinating. I have two questions, so I will just ask them. They are not long ones. So one, when you talk about this dualism, about the weakness and kind of powerful, are you talking about the same conspiracy that would have both, or is it kind of one or the other theme? That's the first question. And then the second question is about the birth of a conspiracy thing. Is it always intentional, or does it kind of start randomly? And is it mostly kind of intentional as in the political context, or does the political context kind of come and take the conspiracy to use it for its own means? So those were
those two. The first one, again, about the dualism between weakness and power, and if it comes together or if it is separate or combined. I can say it can be all three of them. So one conspiratorial reading of the European Union, it's all powerful and crushes all our freedom of choice. In the other one, it says the European Union is too weak to defend ourselves against the Muslim mother, or Russia even. And in the third, it said one person can write in the same manifesto or blog post or social media post, the European Union controls everything I'm doing, but it is so weak, it will not be able to defend me. And that's really contradictory, isn't it? Because it's almost like some kind of father complex, where on the one hand, your father is the person you think will protect you, but on the other hand, he's an alcoholist and is too weak to protect you when he really should to, or something like that. Yeah. And that also, and the next thing that where I thought was it's in the Greek mythology or the Nordic mythology, we have the same ambivalence with the gods that are both humane, very weak. And they can even be, the human beings can even make the revolt against the gods. Yeah, but they can also be all powerful because what they say is still the rules the cosmos and things like that. And that's a weird dualism, isn't it? But it is there. And as you can, and the strange thing to understand, to connect that to the Russian influence operation is, if Europe is weak and decadent and a dying monster, why are you afraid of Europe? What makes you afraid of this? And that we had very many interesting discussions about. And Holger Möller says, it is because the Russians are afraid that they themselves will somehow be infected by this virus that will kill the Russian might and glory. So that is the fear. So it's an operation to do. The other one, the birth of the conspiracy, does it start randomly or intentional? That goes again back to the other thing I was saying before. That depends on who uses that. You can design a conspiracy theory for political psychology, top down, to denigrate your political opponents in a campaign. It can also be the expression of spontaneous frustrations with the state of the art in politics. People on the streets, we don't want to have any mask mandates, or the pandemic is an invention, and big pharma lies and everything of that. It can be an expression of spontaneous frustration. But it can also be planted from outside here, or it can be more structurally a part of a group identification process, and then it is very difficult to do something about it. And so I would say it depends, and therefore we have to look at conspiracy theories in each context and in each expression. Who tells it, and what is the historical context? But then as a political theorist, I would say, as I said before, that systematic changes and strategic shocks are contexts that more likely produce conspiracy narratives as explanations for these big events.
Let me at this point remind people who are following us on Zoom that if you have a question for us, you can write it in the chat. And I think, Ray, we have a first question on Zoom.
We do have somebody who has raised their hand. If you are comfortable with saying your question out loud, I can unmute you. Otherwise, feel free to type it in the chat. Okay, shall I go ahead and unmute?
Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Good evening or good day.
Hello.
Hello, I have a question. My name is William.
Go ahead, William.
So this is, well, EU, both EU and United States related question. What about NATO? What happens if the United States or Britain, for instance, decides not to be in NATO any longer? What will happen to the EU?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you, William.
I think it's a great question because it connects back to what I started with, which is our post-World War order after the Second World War relied upon the idea of international institutions like the NATO, international INGOs, international governmental organizations like the NATO, or the rise of the European Union. What we witness today is that this idea is getting more and more diluted. So we see that the idea of INGOs and the international law ruling how the countries should behave is withering away, or at least loses its power. And in the very moment one of the big players of these organizations withdraws, the power of such organization decreases, and that is of course already the case with Brexit. So if you would say that Britain would withdraw from the NATO and start to meddle itself in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, then we are back in the power politics of the 19th century, where each state plays its own fiddle, and sometimes they're playing together in the so-called concert of Europe. And then we will most likely end up in a situation again that was at the start of the First World War, when you have different alliances across the continent. And if you do something against that country has to go in and make war and so on. We see already signs of that because Great Britain also plays a strange role in the Ukraine conflict right now. And people say Boris Johnson is only engaged because he has to divert attention from his political problems in Great Britain. But in any case, it's a very good question. It relates to what happens if the international order, as we know it after the Second World War, would come to a collapse. And it is in Russian interest as well. And much of the Russian influence stories are about the corruption of these big NGOs. So thank you.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. I saw our guest from Portugal.
Thank you very much for your words, but I would like to stress a little bit on the media speech, on this dualism. I would like to know your opinion about for the topics on the media speech. Sometimes you have like reporting the facts, but we don't have so much analysis in what's going on. What I want to tell is, for instance, in the refugees problem in the Mediterranean, there's a lot of people dying, of course, but we don't know exactly why all of these people are coming to the Mediterranean, right? I mean, the question is, I'll listen to your words, and you speak about sometimes Europa, sometimes about European Union, and we have a dual speech, we have a lot of nationalisms, we have sometimes you speak also about this idea about absolute power and absolute weakness. I never saw this in Europe, but just to end my question is, how do you think a project like that will survive without your leadership, without that is a proof of a deficit, democratic deficit. Mm-hmm. So when you don't have a leadership, you don't have an organization which is strong. And for instance, for this potential war on Ukraine, without an army, could we solve a problem like this?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? It was about, I guess, how media reports about certain things. For instance, the refugee crisis that affects the Mediterranean region and its reasons, and about the absolute power, absolute weakness, and if this might be a leadership question. And let me start at the end. Definitely so. I mean, for us in the volume, of course, most of the authors were writing about EU-related things. And that is, of course, because in political studies, media studies, the EU is an entity that you easily can analyze. Whereas Europe, immediately you slip into this kind of vague definition. What is it? Does it end in the Ural? Then Russia is a part of Europe. And if Russia is a part of Europe, then we have to accept that fact and not draw the border east of Estonia or east of Finland. And if we don't accept that fact, then we have to have all these discussions about what Europe is. As an historian of ideas, I try to push into the book a broader concept of what Europe constitutes, the kind of civilizational ideas and history and religion and philosophy and so on, which without trying to become essentialist. But let's start at the end. Let's start at the end with the leadership question, of course, and that is exactly the problem, because then the question is in simple explanations of cause and effect. Yeah, it is very easy to blame the leadership for systematic failures. And you might have heard that throughout my presentation was talking about the so-called refugee crisis, and I will give you the reason why. Because I think it's an unfair name for that crisis. I think it's a failure of international politics. It's not a crisis of the refugees coming to Europe. It's a crisis of us not being able to contain violence in the Middle East and North America and in North Africa. And therefore, I don't like to use the term refugee crisis, but it is very, very established. So one could also call that crisis a crisis in the national leadership. And the same applies to the reasons why people systematically want to go over the Mediterranean to South Europe. There are many reasons, economical reasons, war, hunger, environment, you name it, yeah? But something is wrong and something has to be done, and who is responsible for that? On conspiratorial readings, it's always there's a plan. Somebody plans to do that. And these kind of almighty leaders are some kind of supranational beings. Whereas our worldly leaders, we frequently blame for their failures. See what I mean? So that's that's a dualism. And I know you work in journalism. Media should not fall into the trap of using either the one or the other characterization of leadership.
Let me be coming close to the end. So let me maybe return to Vienna, to Austria, and give our guest, Karen Liebhardt, an opportunity to ask the final question. Karen, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid this is also a big question, but however I ask it, I fully agree with you that and your argument that conspiracy theory thinking is likely to undermine democratic culture and the rule of law and European democracy. And I would like to ask you, what makes European political culture? How would you characterize it? Is it the rule of law, and is it trust in democratic institution, or is there something else to add?
Yeah, well, in German, that's a Gewissensfrage. It's a question of your conscience, isn't it? Yeah, of course, I believe in that. I mean, I think that a rule of law is one of the greatest achievements of European thought. But then how it plays out in reality, well, that's a completely different question. And then, of course, thinking about the big picture, what makes Europe European without falling into the essentialist trap is also very difficult. So I'd say it's if you want to cherry pick, then you could subscribe to the narrative that the European Union always is pushing, which is like human rights, rule of law, stability, peace. It's a peaceful project, prosperity, and so on. But then, of course, we could be much broader. And what I just want to say, I mean, our book tries to explain that there is a certain psychology in imagining yourself as European as well, isn't it? And that's the point, because if we want to understand the conspiracy theories, we also need to understand what does that say about being European. What do the conspiracy theories in the United States say about what it means to be American, US today? And only by kind of talking openly about what is that in our psyche that makes people believe in these things, that we can come closer to a step of understanding ourselves as inhabitants of that little peninsula of the Eurasian continent, isn't it? And that is what we are trying to say. And when we become aware of this, for instance, the dualism, we are maybe also more likely to overcome it. That's my personal hope. I think we are ending our very last chapter with that we hope that we can turn from fear to hope in our understanding of Europe.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And I'm so glad we could end.
Many thanks again.
With a message of hope. I would like to thank all the people here in Moses Hall for attending the event. We'd like to thank the people who joined us on Zoom, people who followed us in live stream. A special thank you also to our guest moderator, Karen Liebhardt in Vienna. We're very much looking forward, Karen, to your arrival on the Berkeley campus. But of course, the biggest thank you is to our speaker, Andreas Önnerfors, for an excellent presentation. Also for the way you handled all the questions, some of them difficult questions. So thank you so much, Andrea. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you at the next event on Thursday here at the Institute.